been a hot few days here in London, and only today, everyone joining us now, has it cooled to a degree of, I think it's 24, 25 degrees, and relatively pleasant. But I decided to stay in and have a good and reoccurring conversation with a regular guest on the show, Eyre, who is an expert on the JCPOA. You were the first diplomat, if I understand correctly, a US diplomat who could speak fluent Farsi. Is that correct?
Oh, so far from true. Oh. Sweet Jesus. No, and in fact, there's a whole generation of what's called Iranosaurs who had actually served in Iran. You know, one of my good friends was a retired diplomat named John Limbert, who has a doctorate in Persian studies from the great Richard Fry in Harvard, who speaks better Persian than I ever will, who had he also had the unfortunate singularity of being one of the hostages in '79.
Oh, God. My God. Wow.
But I speak fluent Persian, but certainly not the first and hopefully not the last. But it is very hard to be fluent in Persian when, as a diplomat, if you can't be posted in that country. So unless you're a heritage speaker, you know, you grew up speaking Persian, you're an Iranian American, yeah, it's tough.
Well, you are cool enough. It says, according to Wikipedia, you are that important, Alan. You are the first ever Persian language spokesman of the United States Department of State.
The first and last, the only.
Okay, interesting. Okay, well, I guess that's what I was conflating then. But still, we are in a period of turbulence, perhaps unsurprising. I think that this will come as a surprise to no one. But let's break down a little bit. How do you find the past week, 2 weeks since this document was signed? And I should point out, everybody, that this MOU was signed in Versailles, which, considering if you know a bit of your history, probably wasn't the most effective place to do that. But apparently the Trump administration didn't get the memo on their own memo, so to speak, or MOU. So, Alan, I'm just kind of curious what your thoughts are on how things have been since I think we spoke, a couple of weeks ago?
Yeah. Well, first, I don't care if it was signed in Love Canal. You know, the fact that it was signed was the most important part of it. So, you know, let's not get sidetracked by things like that, these little gotchas. But yeah, I'm glad it's signed. As I've said before, you know, this war was a ruinous, mistaken, illegal, immoral war that failed spectacularly. And so the sooner that this U.S. administration realized that and started taking an off-ramp, the better. Now, the problem is it's not that simple. We're sort of stuck on the off-ramp, if you were. And we've seen that the last week. Iran, for reasons that are obvious for anyone who's followed Iran for any amount of time, is going to insist on ongoing control of the Strait of Hormuz for strategic deterrence. That's a deal breaker. That's something Iran is willing to risk renewed hostilities with the U.S. for. So when the U.S. was starting to route ships through a traffic scheme that the Iranians didn't want close to the coast of Oman, it was totally predictable that Iran would start, attacking those ships, which it did, which occasioned the U.S. response and this tit for tat back and forth. It is still the case that both sides do not want to re-escalate into full-fledged war. So we'll see what happens going forward. But again, Iran is willing to risk a renewal of the war to maintain control of the strait. Iran will not back down on this.
Yeah, I made an analysis piece yesterday, and also I think you're underappreciating the significant symbolism of the Versailles location. I think the historical element,
incredibly important, massively important, and I did miss it.
I don't think it's important, but I think it's rather entertaining. But still, what I think is more curious for your take, I'm curious of your take more, is I made this analysis piece, which is simply that in some people's eyes, this has always been the goal of the Iranians, with this sort of the coercive diplomacy. element, which is that they are going to use any and all opportunity to make the conditions even worse for the United States and try to force their hand even more. Do you think that that's not the case because, as you say, they don't want any more heightened escalation as we've seen in the past, 2-3 days?
I mean, I think all diplomacy is coercive. You know, you don't do diplomacy with your friends where you're, you know, dancing around a fire singing "Kumbaya." Diplomacy is working out the differences you have with strategic enemies or strategic rivals. So again, to me, this latest spate of attacks isn't as much a violation of the ceasefire as a compliment. You know, this is something that's got to have to be. This is part of the process, right? This 1.5-page document. You know, ambiguity was the feature and not the bug. There's a lot that has to be ironed out, and this is unfortunately part of the process of it being ironed out. You know, Article 5 was very vague as to what it meant to reopen the strait. And let's be honest, this is a point I think some people miss. This is not a legal document. There's no judge with a gavel who's going to pound his or her, you know, whatever, and say, Iran, you violated the MOU, you have to do this. Or US, you know, by threatening Iran, you violated Article 1 of the MOU, you can no longer threaten Iran. Okay? This MOU is an invitation for a conversation. And yes, it lays out broad guidelines as to how that conversation will proceed, but how the conversation in fact proceeds is purely a function of relative power and leverage going forward. And that's what we're seeing being enacted.
Okay, interesting. I always find our conversations very lively, Alan, and in this case, I do not think you're being a little bit simplistic in your interpretation of diplomacy. How is all diplomacy coercive? I don't think the Italians and the Americans have coercive diplomacy over cultural elements, do they? I mean,
well, I'm just saying that diplomacy, by definition, doesn't have to happen if two countries are in lockstep. So diplomacy, by definition, implies a disparity or a difference in strategic goals. If two countries are in total lockstep, you don't need diplomacy. You just sort of need the coordination. Diplomacy implies the need to negotiate. And when you negotiate, you're bringing your power and your leverage to the negotiation. Okay? So in that sense, you know, if you want to say, you know, it's not coercive, it's collaborative, sure, whatever. I'm just saying that, you know, negotiations and diplomacy are most essential to the extent that there's a clash between two entities. You know, the Iran-US diplomacy is harder and more fraught and more important than, in many ways, you know, US-Canadian diplomacy. Maybe that's not true, but yeah, my point stands is that I think coercion is an essential component of diplomacy.
Okay, no, I think I promised myself I would be more determined in pushing back on points. Okay, not that I'm trying to be coercive, Alan, or anything. No, but okay. So I'm just trying to understand. Therefore, is this just simply a case of tit for tat exchanges right now? Because the Iranians have decided to be much more forceful in their implementation of the Hormuz Strait, and therefore the actions that happen, the United States replying in kind, and now the Iranians are replying in kind, and now we're sort of just in this perpetual cycle of tit for tat. Like yesterday when the Iranians struck, and then the Americans like, okay, we'll strike a couple of targets, and the Iranians are now striking Kuwait and Bahrain. Like, at what point do they stop retargeting things, even if it's in this managed escalation or minimal deterrence and all these sorts of terms?
Well, again, it's Iran is at war with the United States and Israel. This for them is a ceasefire, but the people running Iran now take as a strategic assumption that the US and Israel will continue their efforts to destabilize and get rid of the Islamic Republic of Iran. Okay, so they're not collaborating or negotiating with the U.S. to forge a new and better Middle East, or whatever the phrase was that J.D. Vance said. They're not collaborating so that they can increase their interaction with the United States and work out a modus vivendi that's better for both the U.S. and Iran. Okay. The people running Iran right now take it as a working assumption that even though the US is calling for a ceasefire, that is only because Iran was able to inflict sufficient economic pain on the US by closing the strait and to a lesser extent, bombing the energy infrastructure of their Gulf allies. Okay. But here's the key point. Right now, this negotiating process, that's setting the bones of the body that was broken. Okay. This Middle East, this war broke the Middle East. Okay. Or broke the Persian Gulf area. We're not getting back to the way it was February 27th. So what's happening now, either militarily or on the diplomatic table, there's this clash on as to what the new normal will be in the Middle East, or at least in the Strait. And for Iran, an essential part of that new normal is controlling the flow of maritime traffic through the Strait. Now, that's not necessarily monetizing it right off the bat, or perhaps never. We don't know. Though we do think that Iran needs money. It's either going to get that one of four ways: reparations, which no one wants to pay, tolling or service charges, unblocking assets that are frozen by the US, or easing sanctions, right? And Iran, to an extent, doesn't care. It just needs money to refurbish its defense industrial base and also to throw at the Iranian population so that they don't go out in the streets again.
Well, it's going to get money, though. It's getting 20 billion, as far as I understand. This 300 billion fund, I think, is far-fetched, and clearly the Gulf states have little intention of following through on that. But this is a complete and utter set of freebies from the US to Iran, right? Can you break down what people are missing about this? Because I think there's quite.
They'll get more money if they control maritime traffic through the Strait. The Gulf countries, and you can talk about each one individually because they're all, different to a large extent. But, what's part of what has to happen now, and part of why Secretary Rubio got on a plane and went a couple of days ago to the GCC, is that with the old security architecture, invalidated to an extent, all these countries, both collectively and distributively, have to work out a new security arrangement with the US and with Iran. And Iran has a much stronger hand on the controls if it controls maritime passage through the Strait, right? Then these countries, at least for the short term, because in the longer term, they'll try with varying degrees of success to build workarounds that obviate the need to pay, fealty to Iran. But for the time being, these countries have to work with the fact that Iran could well have control of the Strait, for the foreseeable future. And Iran can monetize that, not just by, charging tolls or service charges, but by a degree of investment in Iran from these countries. Though I agree, this $300 billion is probably not going to happen. Or by unblocking assets, as Qatar has signaled it's willing to do. So, yeah, for a variety of reasons, this should be called the Hormuz War, because that's what it is. Forget Iran's nuclear program, right? For the short term, at least, that's not a threat. It wasn't a threat before the war. And unfortunately, as a result of this war, it's going to be more of a threat if Iran decides to weaponize. But paradoxically, if Iran maintains control of the Strait of Hormuz, perhaps it has less of a desire to build a nuclear weapon.
But I want to explore this a little bit further, because what I do find frustrating a little bit, and maybe, well, with your vast more experience, maybe you'll say there's a reason we do, but I feel like referring to the Gulf states or the GCC collectively is misguided these days. There's greater disalignment or misalignment between them than I think has been in quite a few years. And so I'm just quite interested in how you think each individual country is going to approach this, because from my understanding, they were open to the idea of improving or eventually normalizing relations with Israel if they haven't already, but also trying to now, in reality of the situation, normalize with Iran. It seems to me that they're going to try and hedge a lot more because they can't rely on the United States, but they also want to coexist with the Iranians.
They don't want to. They realize they probably have to because the U.S. security umbrella's got some serious holes. But, Saudi is reaching out and strengthening relations with Pakistan and Turkey. UAE is doubling down on the U.S. and Israel. Oman, who has to work out a modus vivendi on passage through the Strait, has always been closer to Iran. Qatar, to a lesser extent. Bahrain is to a large extent the same as logically equivalent to Saudi Arabia. So each of these countries going forward, you're right. The GCC is a security organization. It believes in collective security, but still, I think each of those countries is going to find a new normal in terms of, yes, maintaining or strengthening ties with the United States. None of these countries are going to move closer, are going to enter the Abraham Accords if they're not already in it. Certainly, I doubt the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia is going to, because there again, what's happening in Gaza? The whole world is to an extent looking at what's happening on the Strait because there's a huge economic consequence there. But don't forget, Israel is having its way in Gaza. It's having its way in the West Bank, despite this agreement, this trilateral agreement that was signed the other day, which it did for domestic political reasons. Israel is not going to leave South Lebanon. So, there are a lot of balls in play. And one of the many things this war has shown is that the Gulf countries can no longer simply outsource their security to the United States by writing checks for weapons systems.
Yeah, so I want to bring in Israel a little bit because I think it's quite fascinating the amount of analysis I've read this week and just generally the tide against Netanyahu is so apparent. He was the arbitrator of the anti-Iranian rhetoric for so many years and wanting to take the fight to Tehran directly. But now it seems to be that his narrative is going backwards and harming him more than helping him. And Israel seems to be being increasingly isolated, even by the US. To what extent do you think that's true? And if so, what do you think that means for Iran's calculus?
It's totally true. But Netanyahu has shot himself in the foot with the U.S. to a large extent, both with this administration and in terms of with the American people. At least, larger segments of the American people are less supportive of Israel than they've ever been historically. That trend started, but increased with the genocide in Gaza, and it's continued with this war against Iran. But Netanyahu, this war is very popular in Israel, right? Netanyahu's domestic political viability rises with U.S. Israeli aggression against Iran and against Israeli aggression on Hezbollah. So if he's forced to stand down not just against Iran, which he sees as head of the snake, which poses an existential threat to Israel, but also stand down against Hezbollah, then politically he's a dead man walking, and he's got to do elections by when? October, November of this year, late October, late November. So, but then again, the old political saw is a week is a lifetime in politics. So, people have read the Fatah over, Netanyahu many times, and, he's survived. He's an incredibly smart politician. And his concentration is no doubt buttressed by the fact that if he messes up, the chances of him going to jail for corruption are significantly higher. So we'll see what he does. But, the bottom line here is, regardless of what happens in the Strait, which is a tremendously destabilizing factor on this ceasefire, the main destabilizing factor still in my mind is Lebanon, southern Lebanon, and the fact that Israel wants to scuttle these negotiations between the U.S. and Iran.
But how can they keep getting away with that? If the United States were to cut the $4 billion or equivalent that they give Israel, would that force their hand? Is that what the Iranians are banking on? That they can put enough pressure on Netanyahu to force the US to even be like, okay, we've had enough of this. For Trump's personal relationship with Bibi to deteriorate to such an extent.
Well, they're not going to bank on President Trump doing anything. He's an unknown variable to the Iranians. They just assume erratic and inconsistent behavior, but they realize there's a bifurcation of strategic goals now between the U.S. and Israel, and they will continue putting pressure on that by insisting that Hezbollah be a part of the ceasefire that was maintained in Article 1, that was written into Article 1 of the MOU, But then again, even though Israel's popular support among the U.S. has weakened, it still has massive support on the Hill, for all the obvious reasons. So I don't see the U.S. really, cutting off military support to Israel. Don't forget that still it is written into U.S. law that Israel maintain QMA, qualitative military advantage, which means that we give them enough weapons to defeat any possible combination of, Arab, Iranian states in the Middle East. That's law. So there's only so much that, I think President Trump can effectively threaten Netanyahu with.
No, it's fair. It makes me think of the bill around NATO and the US being unable to withdraw because it's enshrined in legal docs. But all right, let's flip it around then. What does this do for Trump's standing? Because a lot of people argue that the Abraham Accords are a remarkable achievement and the sort of single biggest, strongest, etc. aspect of Trump's foreign policy in his first term. Is he effectively undoing all of that and sending it completely backwards?
Well, I got to be honest with you. I'm more of an expert on Iran than the U.S. So speaking about U.S. domestic politics, I'm just another guy who reads the papers. But certainly his numbers are suffering. But President Trump's domestic political standing is as low as it's going to go. He's in, I think, the low 30s. He's not getting lower than that. He's got a base who likes him regardless. And he's pretty much at that level now. So, he's hoping that by accepting this ceasefire and by working towards some sort of new normal with Iran, that it will stabilize prices enough heading into the midterms. What he doesn't want is rampant inflation, high gas prices, and all sorts of economic carnage, heading into November. So he's going to get that regardless, just because of the long sort of drag times involved with reopening the strait, even if it fully opened tomorrow. And if it reopens under Iranian administrative control, it's going to be that much harder to get it back to the maritime volumes it had before the war. But yeah, again, he's taken a significant political hit because of this, reckless, miscalculated war. But, as I said 5 minutes ago, a week is a lifetime in politics. It's now June, is it late June? Yeah, late June. So, November 4th is a way off.
Yeah, but okay, let's be specific then. Let's be targeted. You work so acutely on the JCPOA, and as I've joked with other people, this is more just a POA, right? There's no joint and there's no comprehension. It's just a plan of acquiescence. Oh, excuse me, action.
No P. There's no A. It's only O. It's of.
Well, no, it's of acquiescence, right? The US has acquiesced to all the Iranian demands, or you don't even use that word. That's too big a word for Trump's mind to consider, Alan.
Again, the MOU is an invitation to a dance, okay? Yes, the way it's written now, the Iranians seem to have gotten more than we have by far. But again, there is no international law. No one is going to hold someone to account because they're not sticking to the MOU. There's no international arbiter who's going to force an interpretation of the MOU to be implemented by both parties. Okay. All the MOU said is, let's stop fighting for now and let's talk. Right. That's the essence of this MOU. Yes. Okay. And sure, it said, we'll talk about this and we'll talk about that, but that's not binding. It's just signaling an intention or a realization. Here's the MOU. The MOU is a signaling of the joint realization that both sides, for the time being, have gotten pretty much as far as they could in the status quo. And so they're willing to talk to each other to see, how they can de-escalate the situation. That's it.
Yeah, I understand. It's just a framework of what we could potentially achieve. But what is achievable in 60 days if both sides are targeting each other with missile barrages or strikes or in disruptions in the Strait of Hormuz? Realistically, nothing.
No, so here's what you can get. Realistically, in my personal opinion, here's the best we're going to get going forward. An increase, a significant increase in traffic through the Strait under Iranian administrative control. It won't get back to 100%, maybe up to 80% by the end of the year. I think Kepler and some of the others have said that. Best case, it gets to 80% by the end of the year. That's not nothing. Again, we're talking blood flow for the global economy. We're not going to get a nuclear deal. Okay. That's just too heavy a lift for the US administration. Because again, to repeat a point I've said many times, this administration is not good at diplomacy. It doesn't value it. It's purged much of the resident expertise it had for this sort of mission. And whatever residual expertise is left, they're not going to use because those people aren't necessarily politically trusted. The JCPOA was a heavy lift at a time when Iran's nuclear program was relatively rudimentary and there were no other issues. We are now at a point where, thanks to President Trump unilaterally ripping up the JCPOA in 2018, Iran's nuclear program is much more advanced. Iran is much more mistrustful because they've been attacked twice during negotiations. The Iranian leadership is more radicalized because we killed the relatively less radical, less IRGC leadership. And they've got two other issues. They've got Hormuz and they've got Lebanon. So it's like asking a heart surgeon to perform heart surgery on a surfboard while doing a Rubik's Cube, okay? A competent administration, Republican or Democrat, would have found what this administration has to do really, really hard. This administration doesn't have, I think, the requisite expertise or the inclination to do this. It has what I've called strategic attention deficit disorder. It wants to move on to Cuba. It wants to move on, to the 250th anniversary of the U.S. or whatever. So the best we're going to get practically is Strait of Hormuz back at 80% of previous volumes under Iranian control.
Well, you worked on the JCPOA. Would you take up the call if they gave you a call?
No. No, and let's look, I wasn't the mastermind behind the JCPOA. I was there from start to finish, and I was the one who provided Iranian expertise to the negotiating team, right? We had nuclear experts. We had sanctions experts. We had people who were fantastic at negotiations, like Wendy Sherman, Bill Burns, right? So we had a piano with all 88 keys, and we had people who knew how to play all 88 keys. Right now, you have people who don't know how to, like plunking one or two keys, right? Bomb or sort of talk using intermediaries, right? So this is why I say there's not enough expertise. They could call on expertise. There still is ambient expertise. And that to me is a key question. Up here, you've got Vance, Witkoff, and Kushner. They're good at lots of things. None of those things are international diplomacy. So the question is, and they're also busy, right? They're doing other stuff. So who are they delegating to? Who's their Bill Burns? Who's their Wendy Sherman, right? Who's got day-to-day control of this portfolio? That's a necessary but not sufficient condition for progress in these talks.
Okay. People are rather enjoying your extreme metaphors, if I'm honest. And I think the time it takes for me to conjure up the image of what you're describing, I think is more work than the bloke trying to perform heart surgery on the surfboard whilst doing a Rubik's Cube. I think that takes more effort for me to think of that than the guy doing the action. But no, it's a... all right. So what is the Iranian strategy here then? Just hold out, run down the clock for the Iraq? Because what happens after the 60 days? Or nothing happens because it's not legally.
These are people who took shredded classified documents and put them together for months. It's not my original insight that the Iranians are incredibly patient, right? They're not facing midterms in November. They don't have to worry about that. The people who are running Iran right now were perfectly happy to kill and put whatever number you want into thousands of their own people to stay in power. Okay. So they have patience and they realize the importance of this current phase, right? They're not sitting there going, whoa, that was tough, but we weathered it. We're now standing strong, right? They realize that what they won by enduring without moving their red lines could be lost now in these negotiations, or not just negotiations, but what happens during these negotiations, right? Because, I think the technical talks lasted till last Friday. There's some back channel stuff going on, but yeah, they realize that, what is it? What has Clausewitz said? War is diplomacy by other means. For the Iranians, diplomacy is war by other means. So they're still in the war right now. Okay. And control of the strait and what happens to Lebanon, those are two essential fronts of this ongoing war and battle for survival.
But explain to me why there's so much emphasis on Lebanon. Is it because they don't want to lose their flagship proxy, or is it more comprehensive than that?
Well, yeah, again, part of it is they don't need necessarily now Hezbollah as much as they did. They have the Strait of Hormuz, but Hezbollah is the longest of their allies. The Houthis are relatively recent, Hamas less recent, but relations with the Hezbollah, stretch back to before the revolution, right?
Yeah.
So they might need them again. And they also realize that if they throw Hezbollah under the bus, who's going to lie with them in the future, right? So this is again, they have a long-term strategy. And also, and this is a key point, I didn't come up with it, many did, if you maintain the fight against Israel with Lebanon and Hezbollah, that takes heat off. That makes it less likely Israel will attack the U.S. Attack Iran, right? Iran for a long time had this theory of forward defense, which is it's best to fight your enemies outside of the Iranian borders. That wasn't possible starting, early 2025 when Israel started bombing Iran air defense, and so forth and so on, and killing Iran IRGC. But that doesn't mean you can't use that in the future. So if Iran is able to reconstitute Hezbollah and strengthen Hezbollah, that again is a return to its forward defense. There's a good saying, they say generals always fight the last war. And despite what we hear about Iran, there's not a new young generation in control in Iran right now. Iran, they call it in Persian, Pir Solori, which is ruled by old people. Other than Mojtaba, the people running Iran right now are not youngsters. They're pretty old. They've been around since the beginning, most of them, right? So they, in their mind, see Hezbollah as a long-term ally that still retains much strategic utility, and they're going to do what they can, all they can, as Arakchi has signaled many times, to preserve Hezbollah.
But is that strictly true? Yes, they only scrape the surface in this decapitation strategy, but some of the most senior position people are quite young now, aren't they? Because
Nope.
they're still over, what, 60, 70? Does that make a difference?
My definition of old goes up every year I age. So
it's not meant to be personal, Alan.
They're all in their mid to late 60s or older, except for Mojtaba, right? Iran has always done this. They just, it's you stay in power as long as you can, and then you die in some other old person. Look at the Council of Experts. Karim Sajjadpour has a great joke. He says the average age of the Council of Experts is dead. There are all these 80-year-old plus clerics. You've got people like Mohsen Rezai, right? Who is an advisor to Mojtaba, who was, one of the guys who was, committing terrorist acts in 79 as part of Mansouriyoun. So, yeah, I've got a list. I don't have it on me, but, you look at the 10 or 11 people running Iran right now. Most of them are in their 60s, I think, mid to late 60s or older.
So I was interested. I was listening to an interesting podcast by the Financial Times. I think it was the Rachman Review, and
Right.
he was talking to the FT correspondent in Tehran, and she was explaining the divergence between hardliners, moderates, restrainers, or the ultra nationalists, even a word she used. How accurate is that? How diverse is the political outlook within the Islamic Republic? Is it all largely, I appreciate on the war, it's been largely unified, but now that they're returning to sort of, to some degree, internal matters, are we going to see sort of conflicts rise again because of the differences in power and changes in leadership now? Or like, I'm very curious if you think there's a bigger deal there or not really.
Well, Iran has politics like every other country, right?
Sure.
Now, as someone who's followed Iran since '84, one of the key dynamics is Iran, this political center has kept moving rightwards, you know? So, there used to be in the beginning, there was the right and the left, right?
Right.
And paradoxically, Khomeini favored the left. But when he died, it started moving right.
Well, can I just on that? But when you say left and right, what in the context of the Western system, what does left look like? Republicanism?
Right was like the bazaris, the merchants, wanted to make money.
Okay.
Left was more sort of pan-Islamic socialist fusion with, the
Wow.
the phraseology is Persian, the Rost and Chap, right and left. And what happened was in 1988, no, excuse me, after Rafsanjani's presidency,
Yes.
right, the new candidate was the guy that everyone thought was going to win was the Speaker of the Majlis, Nateki Nouri, who was a conservative, right? So the leftists didn't want to put anybody forward. They went to the former prime minister, who was sort of the poster child for the left, Mir Hossein Mousavi, who had been prime minister, but then after Khomeini died, the new constitution did away with the position of prime minister, right? So he sort of retired. They asked him to run against Natek Nouri. He said, I'm not going to run because the guy, beat me. So finally, they settled on a former culture minister of Rafsanjani, this guy Khatami, right? And he said, yeah, I'll run. But, he fully expected to get whooped. And for a variety of reasons, he won. And all contemporary politics are a reaction to that victory, the two victories of Khatami, right? Because then Ayatollah Khamenei said, never again. Okay? I do not want a president who has his own popular base of support. Okay? So the Iranian spectrum kept moving right. So at one point, you had a guy like Ali Larijani, who was far right. And as time passes, he becomes so sort of left or left behind that he's precluded from running for president. Okay? So right now, what you have in Iran is you have sort of traditional right wing, people like Ghalibaf, and hardcore right wing, people called Paydariha, the Stabilization Front. And yeah, you have some reformists like the president, who's putatively a reformist, but the reformists as a political party in Iran have no power whatsoever. Okay, none. So you have basically a fight right now in Iran between hardcore right and sort of traditional right. But overarching all of that, you have the IRGC, which is to an extent apolitical. And again, overarching this whole dynamic, you've got this shift to the right. And then you also have, especially since Khomeini died, a shift to more traditional nationalism. Khomeini famously didn't care about Iran. He wasn't a nationalist. He wanted to spread the Islamic Revolution globally. Okay? But especially since after he died, it got harder and harder to rally the people around such a vision. And Iranians, by and large, are nationalists. So Iran has had more and more of a nationalist, openly nationalist foreign policy, right? What is Iran's strategic goal? Why is Iran doing what it's doing? Because it wants to be the regional hegemon in the Persian Gulf. And for Iran, it is the Persian Gulf, because Iran looks at itself in the mirror and says, I'm a 5,000-year-old country with a rich civilization and literature. All these countries mostly are creations of Sykes-Picot. They're hand puppets of the West. Okay? So that's what Iran foreign policy is right now. Iranian foreign policy now is the exact same as it was during the Shah's time. It's just with different tools because it doesn't have the fifth largest army in the world anymore, right? It has to use asymmetrical power projection. But the goal is the same. Iran is the regional hegemon, which is why it doesn't want the U.S., lounging about, with the Fifth Fleet in the Persian Gulf.
But how can it be the regional hegemon, Alan, if they have been undermined or set back? I mean, yes, the military has been not as badly damaged in any way, shape, or form as the Trump administration claimed or intended for it to be. But can we really say that they're the regional hegemon?
I can't say that. I can say that's their goal. They want to exercise decisive influence. Having control of the Strait of Hormuz will help them. Having 95 million people and one of the richest supplies of oil and gas in the world will help them. Having a great strategic location will help them. I'm not saying their goal is realistic or achievable. I'm just saying what their goal is,
Yeah, no, I understand. I'm just being, as I say, deliberately provocative or contrarian. But okay, so then if we bring this into where Mujtaba is, where is he? Is he alive? What's he doing? He's a lot more pragmatic. We've had this conversation before. Where's he sit in all of this? And does he have any say at all? Or it's much more the IRGC and he's just a figurehead because of how the power dynamics have changed after this war?
When Ayatollah Khomeini died, two people decided who'd be the next supreme leader. His son, Ahmad, and Rafsanjani, right? And they got together and they figured it out. And they, for a variety of reasons, picked Ayatollah Khomeini, who at that point was president, which was a relatively insignificant position because the way the system was arranged, the prime minister, Mousavi, had all the power. Mm-hmm. Okay. And once Khomeini was elected supreme leader, he still had almost no power. He essentially sat in an empty room and didn't do much. But the cool thing about being supreme leader is it's a position for life. You get to pick people for key positions. And so slowly over time, Khomeini became more and more powerful and all lines ran to him. Okay. So, and he became for most of his career, the fulcrum, the center of political power in Iran. Took a while to get there. But once he had all those lines running to him and all that money running to him, maintaining that was easy. So he dies, we kill him. And his son has already been sort of on the fringes of power, been sort of a player for like 15 years, right? If Khomeini had died peacefully in his bed, Mojtaba would not be supreme leader. But the IRGC, for a variety of reasons, took over the process. It wasn't like the Council of Cardinals with, Catholicism. The IRGC foisted this guy to be the new supreme leader. And right now he's relatively powerless. He still has a lot of the same associations his dad had, but yeah, he's hiding out because he doesn't want to be killed by the Israelis. And, the system is churning. And even though they putatively have to get his approval for this and that, he's putting out the same sort of mealy-mouthed statements his dad would have. He's not his father yet. He will be over time if he survives. But the people running Iran right now, they're about, 10 mostly military IRGC leaders who, deliberate and make a decision. A lot of it done at the Supreme National Security Council, Supreme Defense Council. And then, Khomeini puts his imprimatur on it. Now, some of these people are stronger than others, but this is not the system we had before Khomeini died, where he said, we're doing this. And everyone else said, okay, boss.
Okay. No, it's interesting for me because I think it was you who we've touched on about how Khamenei actually helped to balance the theocratic versus pragmatic sides of this whole system. But with him gone now, the theocracy aspect seems to really fall by the wayside.
There's no theocracy in Iran died a long time ago. Ayatollah Khomeini was the real deal. He was an Islamic scholar. He was a legitimate grand Ayatollah, right? And he came to power at a time where the clerical class was an independent class with independent funding that had power that opposed the Shah. One of the consequences of the revolution was the clerical class lost its independence, lost its independent financial backing, and became an appendage of the state. Khomeini, when he was made supreme leader, they had to change the constitution because he didn't have the theological, gravitas to meet the criteria. So they lowered the criteria, right? He was a Hojjatul Islam, so he didn't have that clerical oomph, and he never got it, right? So the position was governmentized. So the clerical class in Iran, since Khomeini came to power, yeah, they dress in robes and they're in key positions, but the whole clerical aspect is it's like communism was in the USSR. Everyone could quote Marx, right? But no one believed it, and it wasn't really how things ran. Iran right now is a military security state that's got this theological veneer, patina over it. They still speak in that manner, and many of them believe it, right? I'm not saying it's essentially secular society. The leadership isn't. Many of these clerics, many of the IRGC are devoutly religious, and they believe in the system, which is in essence, a clerically based one. But as a practical matter, it's a police state. Okay? It's a military police state.
Okay. No, I mean, that's why I thought it's been going for years, and this war has only just intensified and solidified that, to be honest with you. But then, okay, so if we bring it to the here and now, then, Alan, where does this leave us? If this 60-day, or more seemingly likely, when this 60-day MOU sort of fizzles out, are we just back at square one? We're in this perpetual limbo. We're not at war, but we are. We're just not seeing any conflict. The blockades have been lifted. The Hormuz Strait is sort of open, but at the behest of Iran. How do we actually find tangible shifts? Like there is an agreement on one specific part of the deal. There's an actual something signed, something that a clear deliverable with clear, targeted, defined terms, or you just don't think we're going to see that because of the two sides?
I don't care what's signed. Again, it's like, people get all fixated about signing ceremonies, like, the trilateral Lebanon, Israel, US signing thing, or the signing of the MOU. Signing doesn't count. What counts is the physical reality of how many ships go through the strait. We're not going to get things settled in 60 days. It is unlikely we'll get things settled in 120 days. It is possible, perhaps probable, we won't get settled. And what we'll have is the status quo where the U.S. says Iran is committed to never having a nuclear weapon. The U.S. and Israel will be monitoring the Iranian nuclear sites. I don't think the IAEA will get back in there anytime soon in a vigorous, effective way. But Iran is smart enough not to start trying to reconstitute its nuclear program now because they don't need to. And they know that will be a casus belli for future attacks by the U.S. or by Israel. Okay? So they're going to leave their nuclear program, I would guess, alone for the time being. They'll negotiate with the U.S. because why not, right? If that just keeps the process going, they're perfectly willing to do that. But the only variable that matters is maritime traffic through the strait.
Sure. But what is the inflection point? When can we say that this bloody thing is over?
I'll say it's over when we get back to close to 100%, 100 to 130 ships a day, not just exiting the strait, but going back in, because, when global supply chains have recalibrated to the new normal, I don't think we're ever going to get back to the way it was before. I think we won't get back in the next year or so, at least, to 100, 130 ships a day through the strait. I think there'll be a constricted flow. I think Iran will maintain control, and there won't be a nuclear agreement. So, yeah, it's sort of neither peace nor war. You might have these occasional flare-ups. A lot of it depends with what's going on with Lebanon and Israel, because what happens with these elections with Netanyahu. It's quite possible that the next prime minister of Israel is more right wing than Netanyahu, right? So again, here's the bottom line for me. We broke a complex system. It's going to take a long time to find a new homeostasis, a new normal. We're not there yet. We're not going to be there for at least a year or so. So we're in a period of transition. And, it's like the Clash said, the future is unwritten. Know your rights.
Nice point to end on. But just to summarize, so
Yeah.
simple yes or no, I guess. But so we're going to be in a new normal of Strait of Hormuz is sort of open, largely under Iranian terms. We'll see flare-ups like we do in the past few days periodically. There will be talks, but they might not go anywhere, and we just live in this perpetual state of instability, even more than we were. That's the reality for the next few months.
Not really, because I think one of the things, just to sort of to clarify, because I know you chide me when I'm too simplistic, is that if it's an ambiguous, uncertain situation in the strait, we're not going to get back to 80%. Maritime insurance, people who own ships, people who own cargo, they don't like the phrase, yeah, you're probably safe. So I think that this uncertain, obscure, ambient danger situation will preclude, getting to 80%. So, it's ambiguity is ambiguity as to the strait precludes and works against resumption of near normal flows. So
I mean, look, from my perspective, people were like, "Oh, new normal." Yeah, guys, it's like COVID, right? New sort of normal to me.
Exactly.
But I think just like this has permanently changed how we see international maritime law as well. I think it's fundamentally changed so many basic things that we've taken for granted. The United States has been for decades the arbitrator of safe passage in a way that we've never really fully appreciated up until this point.
International law took a huge hit in Trump 1. It's taken a bigger hit in Trump 2. So, it's a far more Hobbesian situation than we had before. Hobbesian. And with that, I got to run now.
Thanks a lot, everyone, for watching. Thanks, Alan, for your time. And as always, everyone, if you like the video, then of course subscribe and like it, and do check out Alan's work and commentary as well. But we'll see you all very soon. Take care.
Thank you very much.